Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is your host, Kyle Bullard, and today on the show, I have the honor and privilege to sit down with Dr. Matthew Johnson, professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins University. If this is your first time stumbling across Dr. Johnson's work, there's a chance maybe it isn't, because he's contributed quite a bit in the psychedelic world. You maybe read some papers that he's contributed to, maybe didn't know it. You can just do a little Google search on him. But if you want to go back into the Psychedelics Today archive, we did a really fantastic interview with him. It is episode 229, and that title is Dr. Johnson, What is Consciousness? And we discuss a paper that he wrote called Consciousness, Religion, Gurus, and the Pitfalls of Psychedelic Medicine. In this episode, we get to sit down and chat about so many different things, but we start off talking about just how the field has been growing and evolving over the years and how it feels like we're also at the beginning and the infancy of the field, and how many questions are still left unanswered and so many questions to explore, which is exciting, maybe also nerve-wracking for some folks. I always like to mention, if you want to work in the psychedelic world, get a little comfortable with being uncomfortable and uncertainty, because there's so much we still don't know about these medicines, these compounds. And in the things that maybe we don't know, and what we were exploring is just the science around integration. And so it's kind of fascinating. There hasn't been much research around this whole concept of integration. I believe there was just a paper put out pretty recently about the optimal window periods for psychedelics. But what can we do during those times to really help maybe strengthen neural pathways and really kind of double down on that neuroplastic window to create change in our world? We also talk about psychedelic therapy protocols and how, are the ones that we're currently using in research and therapy the best? Some of these protocols were developed in the 50s and 60s, and, could we be weaving in other modalities? And so one thing that we were talking about was maybe psycholytic therapy, right? That seemed to kind of vanish. And that's with low to possible medium doses of psychedelics engaged more in a talk therapy type of protocol versus eye shades and very internal. So still, there's still lots of questions to be answered, and it feels like we're still just at the beginning of this psychedelic wave, even though it feels like it's been here for a bit. We also get into what's been happening in Oregon. We hear a little bit of updates around the smoking cessation studies and research that's happening at Hopkins. We also talk a little bit about music as well, music and psychedelics. So that's it for this little intro. Just some reminders before we jump into the episode that if you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you follow us on social medias across the board: Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, I guess is now called X. You can follow us over there. So I think that's it, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Matthew Johnson, and we will catch you on the other side. Dr. Matt Johnson, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Really excited to have you
Kyle.
here.
Glad to be here. Yeah.
So you just did an 8-hour workshop, you said, here at Psychedelic Science?
Yeah.
How was that?
That was intense. I probably was overambitious in volunteering for that, but 8 hours, it was just me talking about psychedelic therapy for addiction treatment. And, that's a long time.
That's a long time.
At the end of the day, you definitely start having imposter syndrome. Like, why is everyone listening to me?
That's interesting to hear that come from somebody so prominent as you, right? I think that's something a lot of people struggle with. So that's
it's true. And, I think it's a lot of topics, people have great ideas, whether they're someone looking to go into grad school or someone who's been doing research for decades. And I don't know, so often in the psychedelic area, like some of the questions that come up at the end of a talk or a workshop are like, well, has whatever been tried, or what do you think about this? What about combining psychedelic therapy with this, that, or the other? And for so many of those questions, the answer is something like, that's a really good idea. Someone should do that. Right. Like, I don't know. Like, what do you think? Like, there's just so many open questions and so many kind of flags to be staked that, yeah, any kind of, aspiring, student, could be coming up with many great ideas because
Yeah.
the field is wide open.
Yeah. So thinking about some of the questions that people are asking, I mean, you've been around for so long and contributed so much to the field. Being here at Psychedelic Science, I mean, I think Rick said that they sold 11,500 tickets. So this feels definitely like the biggest conference. How have you seen things change over times? And like even just thinking about like questions, like I think I hear that too when people ask us questions where it's like earlier on, people are a little okay with uncertainty. Like you're just saying, I don't know, it's a good idea, or I don't know about that. Versus, I don't know, sometimes I feel like people are like, wait, no, this is certain, right? There's all this research to back it. So I'm wondering like
Right.
how like you've been feeling as this field has been progressing and things that you've noticed over the years.
Yeah, I still think I often find myself telling people, like, I think the field is in its infancy. As much
Yeah.
as we figured out, it's still almost nothing. I mean, we have virtually no, there's questions around, like yesterday, there's questions around, well, is there any reason that, I don't know, you're using psilocybin versus some other psychedelic to help
Mm,
people quit tobacco smoking? Is there any, is there, why are you using cognitive behavioral therapy as the type of talk therapy as the backdrop for that study versus some other form of talk therapy? And it's,
yeah.
so many of the answers are so like arbitrary. It's like, it seemed like a good idea. Something else might work just as well.
Yeah.
Like we haven't gotten to the point yet that where we're, I don't know. So I'm hoping to do some work with psilocybin and PTSD, for example. And
Mm,
let's say, for example, it shows promise. Well, we have a pretty good idea right now. MDMA
right.
is pretty damn good for helping people with PTSD. So then, okay, then you could have the studies of psilocybin versus MDMA, and then you can get more advanced. It's like, okay, what about following up some of these things that have happened for a long time in the underground? It's like, oh, first we start you on MDMA, then depending on your response, maybe the next session will move you up
Right.
to a high dose of psilocybin and get to these more complex areas. But yeah, like virtually not so much of what's being done right now is relatively arbitrary,
Right.
and we don't really know. It's like, yeah, would LSD work better than psilocybin for helping people quit smoking? Maybe. Who
Maybe.
knows?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I always like to remind people of that too. It's like we're just at the beginning of the beginning. It feels like, and there's
Yeah.
just so much for us to really know and explore. And so it's just refreshing to hear you say that as well. And yeah, I mean, what like working in this field for a while, like, is there anything that excites you? Like even just kind of hearing, like, start off with MDMA and then maybe psilocybin. Like, do protocols like that interest you? Is that like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, totally. In fact, I would want to do that as a first stab, other than, the fact that, oh, let's say you did a study where you gave first MDMA and then psilocybin in the next session, and it looked like it really helped PTSD. Well, how do you know it wasn't all the MDMA that was driving everything? Because
right,
again, we have a pretty good idea. MDMA can be really helpful if done right for PTSD. So yeah, I'm really excited about the possibility for those more kind of nuanced answers, and really more of like getting into like, how do we conduct psychedelic therapy? It's not just about
mm,
novel compounds and
yeah,
different psychedelics, and which is, interesting for sure. But I have a feeling like most of the interesting action is like, how do we conduct the therapy? I remind people we're still essentially using the same model that was described in the late 1950s, the
right,
psychedelic therapy, like a big dose of a psychedelic, have them lay down, introspective frame, close their eyes, wear eye shades, listen to music. I mean,
yeah,
works pretty damn well, but you know, the popular model back in the older 50s and 60s era with LSD research in Europe was psycholytic
psycholytic, yeah,
therapy. So the idea, instead of using a so-called like heroic, very high dose, a relatively few number of very high doses, an overwhelming dose for a very powerful psychedelic experience, psycholytic therapy used about 100 micrograms of LSD, sort of definitely not a microdose, but sort of an entry level full psychedelic,
Yeah.
not an overwhelming dose, but kind of entry level, full, decent psychedelic dose, but to have ongoing talk therapy during, like when someone is on the psychedelic, and which is easier at 100 micrograms versus 300 easier to talk intelligently. And so this might be equivalent to, like, say, 10 versus 30 milligrams of psilocybin, if we want to talk about psilocybin.
Yeah.
So like, we don't even know that the psychedelic therapy model works better than the psycholytic therapy. It's kind of an accident of history that maybe because so much of this work is happening in America, and that's the psychedelic model was more common in America versus Europe. But who knows? But so we just, like, all the work on neuroplasticity, for example, in rodents, if that turns out to be relevant to the human therapeutic work, if this is telling us that there is a window perhaps following a psychedelic experience where one is biologically primed for rapid enhanced learning, like, how big is that window?
Right.
What do we do during that time? What's the variability of the length of that time?
Are there certain practices that could really help to reinforce certain behaviors?
Right.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, there's essentially no science of integration right now.
Yeah.
Like, what I've done in my studies is, like, ask people to write something about their experience when they go home after the session, and then discuss it with them the next day, and just kind of go where the conversation leads, unpack, help, reflective listening, help the person think about and process their experience and what it might mean for them. But that's it. There's like 1,000 ideas you could. What about having people, explicitly journal on a more frequent basis? What about people, engaging in art, or, any form of art? What about engaging in, I don't know, meditative practice specifically within a certain window following the experience? I mean, if that really is like a window of increased plasticity.
Yeah.
So that's what I kind of get excited about for the future, just figuring out technologies behaviorally of how we maximize, how do we help the people that aren't being helped right now? Because it doesn't work for everyone.
No, it doesn't.
And it never will work for everyone, but how do we increase that as much as possible?
Right. Yeah, and I think, I just wrote down here, like, what is integration and how do we even measure that, right? So, like, I don't know, when I think about it, it could mean so many different things. And sometimes it feels like that integration process is very, like, circular, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, it's not so linear. And sometimes it goes all over the place. And it's like, how do you measure that? Are you just measuring the first, like, few weeks or a month, and, like, measuring what type of self-care practices people are doing, how they're grounding themselves? Or are we measuring more of these, like, longer processes where, you're integrating these philosophical insights in your life in a totally different way, or a spiritual, belief system? And how does that change happen over maybe a lifetime,
Right. And some of that might, unfold over, as you suggest, like years and decades, perhaps. I mean, people still processing psychedelic experiences from.
I know, I still am.
Yeah.
My near-death experience, I'm constantly coming back to that and going, like, oh, what has that taught me? How do I keep bringing these insights into my life? And it's challenging. Some days it's like, oh, I think I got it. And then other times I'm like, well.
Yeah. So I think in the psychedelic world in general, I think it reminds me of, maybe one goal is to make some progress in terms of defining our terms. Like, what do we mean by integration? I mean, we tend to use, like, admittedly, we are in uncharted territory. So sometimes there's no existing word.
Yeah.
But some of the words, like, I don't know, some of it can, like, alienate folks not familiar with the area. Like, in the session, like, being a good guide, you want to hold space. It's like, okay, I gotta grab the air. I gotta.
I didn't think about that. That's funny. Yeah.
Anyone who might just be listening, I'm trying to grab the air around me with my hands. I'm holding space. Like, might we reach a wider audience of healthcare professionals to get into this area by saying, okay, you need to pay attention and care for, really, verbally and non-verbally, let the person know you're caring for them, keeping them, and pay attention. It's like, it doesn't quite sound so mysterious, like, how do I hold space? And maybe integration is this, like, what is this mysterious, magical integration? It's like, it's just talking about session, which is, which seems to be really, really important, but it's processing, it's talking about the session. So maybe sometimes we need to, refine our language a little bit as this field moves forward to help move it forward, and to kind of, as it grows and more people come in from different areas, they're not so, it doesn't look like something so strange. Like
Right.
it's not for them. It's not just a new agey thing or a hippie thing. It's like a human thing.
Right.
Which works great for new agey and hippie folks, but also works great for all kinds of other folks too.
Trying to find some more common language. And I just even think about when we're talking about integration, the amount of emails I would get from, like, say, people finding me on the MAPS list and going, "Oh, psychedelic integration. Can I have a psilocybin session with you?" I'm like, no, that's not what that means, right? And always having to do some sort of education around, like, that's not what that phrase means, actually.
Right. Yeah. Has anyone ever asked, like, man, I took calculus in college. How in the hell do you do integration when you're tripping?
I don't think I got
That's
there.
a bad joke.
No. Well, I mean, it's a good analogy, right? Like, how do you then, like, bring that into your life after, like, learning something like that? Most people just forget about it, right? And you don't typically integrate it. I don't remember some of my math in high school. It's like, well, now we got calculators and technology has advanced so much where it's like, oh, I have this technology that will help me out here.
Interesting. Yeah. So maybe there's more meat to that seemingly superficial analogy than I realized at first. Yeah, because like I'm sure I would fail on a lot of those like math tests as well.
If I took the SAT right now, I'd definitely bomb it.
Yeah, like unless you practice a skill and keep it in the routine, the law of entropy works throughout the universe. You tend to lose it. Things go towards chaos.
Yeah, so I guess that it really does come back to like that practice and embodiment, and then maybe how you're showing up in your life. So if you have a big insight, like earlier we were talking a little bit about integrity, right? And it's like if you get a message like that, and it's like how do you then operate in your life with that? And that's hard to do sometimes,
right? Yeah. And I think a huge part of how psychedelic therapy works, this big mystery of like, how in the world could there be like these beneficial effects that we can see in someone's behavior, their substance use, their depression, 6 months, a year later, from 1, 2, or 3 medication experiences that were time limited. And, there's all kinds of ways to think about that. But I think surely what has to be going on, it's, you said something that was in this category, like the people are changing the way they're operating.
Mm.
And the more you start to do that, and that starts to become the new normal.
Yeah.
So it's not just ending at the psychedelic session or even in the explicit integration sessions where you talk about your psychedelic therapy, or your psychedelic session. But then if you put into practice, like, actually changing the way you're operating in the world.
Yeah.
And that becomes the new normal. I think that's what's happening to explain why we're seeing these beneficial effects 6 months, a year later. It's this kind of the causal nature of the therapeutic mechanisms are unfolding over time in a kind of a living, organic way.
Yeah.
Because people they're interfacing with reality in a different way that can, if they're doing it right, it can have a feed forward effect. Like, oh, this actually works. I feel better.
Yeah.
I'm doing better in life when I do things more this way than the way I used to do them.
Yeah. Thinking about like the research that you've done, and we're talking about the integration being post, but when you mentioned that, I was also thinking like the preparation too. And, are there folks that like didn't really want to change? Like maybe they just wanted to have a psychedelic experience, and would that impact them versus the person that was like, I really want to quit smoking, and I'm doing this research because I actually want to quit, versus somebody that's coming in and going, I don't really know if I want to quit. Like, did you have anybody that was a little ambivalent about like wanting to quit cigarettes, and they still had change?
Well, let's see. I'll preface this by saying we have only recently dosed the last of our person in a study. It's going to end up being, I believe, 82 people in this kind of the more recent large randomized study looking at psilocybin for smoking cessation. So we'll have some data that we haven't analyzed to hopefully address that a little more.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't hold your breath because we might have limited variability there. In other words, we had to be convinced that you really wanted to quit smoking to get into the study.
Right.
might be some differences across people, but on a 10-point scale, I'm just making up numbers. It might be the difference between an 8, 9, or a 10.
Yeah.
They're all pretty much towards the top of the scale of being motivated to quit. So who knows? We'll be looking at that. But I thought it was interesting to go into the smoking cessation work, is that some of the previous work I had done was in so-called healthy normals, people without a disorder, but focused on mystical experience and personality change, all kinds of very interesting things I'm fascinated by. But in some sense, your typical participant is someone who's into different spiritual endeavors. They do workshops of this type or another, and they're sort of spiritual seekers, and it's
Yeah.
this, that, or the other, and that's a certain population, and one might critique it as like, well, that person might be primed with certain expectations about psychedelic therapy, or they might just be different than the general public. And so, but with the smoking cessation work, while there certainly is variability, there are definitely those people that come in and it's just very convincing. They're like, dude, I just want to quit smoking. Honestly, this sounds like really crazy, but it seems like, yeah, you guys are a legit hospital. So like, whatever, they say my everyone's been called. I'm thinking one person, everyone wants me to quit smoking. My mother-in-law finally said, I saw this on some talk show. You need to do this. Call these people up.
Yeah.
And so I am. And I'm most interested in those folks because, that aren't drawn to it.
Right.
Because, it's a chance to legally do, psilocybin. They're the folks that, they've tried everything but the kitchen sink, and, oh, wow, this sounds like the kitchen sink.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's like the one thing they haven't done, but they just really want to quit smoking. So it's getting kind of closer, perhaps, to what you would get, if, psychedelic therapy is widely accepted and it's available to millions of people, and you're going to be treating more of a normal, kind of everyday general population.
Yeah.
Without a special interest. Then we get those folks too. Oh, you've been reading about shamanism for years, and maybe you've always wanted to do this, but you kind of didn't want to do it in college because the risk kind of scared you. But now there's those types of people too. But there's also just the folks that are like, I just want to quit smoking, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when it works for those people, it's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me, I guess, think, how effective is psychedelic therapy going to be in the future once this does become more normalized? And I mean, I think about it of having people reaching out to me in the past around integration work and reading all the news articles, having very high expectations around it, and then also, they're taking it in maybe underground ceremonies and stuff like that, but then not having those big changes, right? And then like actually sometimes almost being traumatized by it. And it makes
traumatized by not having the changes,
or just some
traumatized
really
by the
difficult stuff
experience?
would come
Okay,
up where
yeah.
they would have like, I remember somebody asking, is it normal to just feel really anxious like a week after like a psilocybin experience? Like, I did this to better my health, and all of a sudden like my anxiety is just peaking like crazy right now.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I wonder as it starts to become more legal and accessible, we'll probably see some obviously different numbers from the therapeutic approach.
I think so. And one of the common patterns with new therapeutic modalities, different ways, new ways to treat mental health, is that the earlier studies by the early adopters, that the effect size, which is statistical nerd speak for like, how if it helps you, how much did it help you? How big is the effect? How impressive is that improvement? The effect size tends to get smaller as it gets disseminated, as other researchers start to do it, and then it even beyond that, when it's say approved as a treatment and it's widely disseminated, and that could be for a number of reasons, that it's kind of a watering down the people that once it's widely disseminated aren't doing it quite as well. Maybe the people, the early adopters, the researchers, had their hearts in it, like especially so. Maybe they just were really enthusiastic about it in one way, shape, or form that sort of resulted in better treatment. So that is a common pattern that I would surprise to not see to some degree.
Yeah.
But the exciting thing about a lot of these psychedelic therapy results, whether it's MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for depression, psilocybin for addiction, is that a lot of the results we're seeing, the effects are so big that even if they turn out being half the size,
Right.
they're still freaking enormous. I mean, they're still poised to help like a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that's, they're so big right now that gives me some confidence, even with that probably inevitable decline in efficacy.
Yeah.
It's still going to help a lot of people.
How are you feeling about some of the new, I guess, structures, like say Oregon, for example, where it's like outside the clinical model, it's an adult use model, and we'll have those service centers. And I know people have been talking about accessibility. I think some of those sessions are like $3,500 to start. But
Yeah.
that price is going to go down over time,
Right.
right? Or
Yeah.
we're here in Colorado and Prop 122 passed, and they have that decrim initiative. They have the legalization initiative. How are you feeling about kind of like how this ecosystem is developing and the possible services that may be available in the future?
And I think it's important to say broad strokes. I'm glad we're nationally having this experiment.
Yeah.
I think, frankly, even though, we can get into some of the nuances and concerns and recommendations I might have, but biggest picture, it's really easy to be a researcher, especially one focused on, federally sanctioned research, looking for ultimately for FDA approval, like myself, to just step back and say, well, anything other than that, like, is just a distraction, and is nothing but, it can only risk like what we're doing to get things like approved by the FDA. There's kind of a selfishness there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really important just to, even though I definitely think psychedelics should be brought through the FDA and, the other international equivalents, Health Canada, EMA in Europe, pathways to see if we can use these formally as medicine. Still, it's like, it's not right that people are getting criminal records for having mushrooms or any of this other stuff. And I feel just as strongly, it's probably even more important for far more dangerous drugs, opioids, stimulants like methamphetamine, cocaine. So I want to be clear about that. So as much as we can do to experiment to move away from this criminal prohibition model and this sort of like the controlled use in Oregon, I'm not even really sure what to call it, because originally it was sort of framed in the ballot initiative as therapy, but I think they've backed away from therapy. And actually, that's probably a good thing in some sense, because once you're treating, like, so you're treating PTSD or, that's the practice of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't know what you're doing, if you're not, and as I believe the law is set up, you don't have to have formal educational, and I could be wrong about this. I don't know where they've
GED,
landed.
high school diploma, and then a training program that's like 120 hours plus a 40-hour practicum.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that does not make you qualified to treat PTSD.
Right. Yeah.
So, there are some questions about, okay, then how much of what's going on is really kind of a wink and a nod? It's really treatment. It's not being called treatment. And there'll be some of that, regardless of how careful you are to navigate that. But I think, a good faith effort should be made in a number of ways to keep people safe, to, if it's not supposed to be therapy, and, because you may not have the qualified folks there for that. Because there's some of these disorders like PTSD, someone could, like, from an armchair, kind of backseat driver perspective, what your common sense might say in terms of what might be helpful might be harmful to the person. And so there are some concerns there. I have concerns about, like, what the screening looks like. Is it, for example, is any physical required, even if you're just required to go off to your own physician and, get your own physical done and bring it back and show you don't have severe heart disease or whatnot? Or is it, a form, with like, 24 check marks, like, do you have this, yes or no? And then you realize the more times you say yes, maybe it means you can't get the treatment. So you just check no on everything.
Yeah, you just lie about it.
Yeah, and like, is it going to be? So I have those concerns, but I believe in the federalist system that we have in our country, the United States. Like, let the states experiment.
Yeah.
Let Oregon do it. Let other states and the federal government look at it. Let's see what happens. Maybe we want to copy it. Maybe they're going to screw up, do something wrong. Maybe we can do something different. We could take it. Maybe we decide not to do it at all. Like, yeah, I don't want to be like moralistic and kind of just because it's not going through the FDA pathway.
Yeah.
So overall, I'm a fan, but I do have opinions and recommendations about the devil in the details,
Totally.
and I'm hoping, I'm a fan that it's going to help, people. It's going to be a good thing,
Yeah.
and that people aren't going to be harmed.
Well, and I think to come back to that point, that people aren't going to prison and getting criminal
Right.
offenses, right? And it's like, I don't know, yeah, you just kind of saying it's an experiment is kind of interesting, right? It's like we are in this really interesting time where it's like, what is going to happen? I think we're all kind of just waiting to see, like, how is this going to unfold? I remember Joe and I were just chatting like maybe a month ago, just around like cannabis legalization, and we just were talking about the decrease of cannabis use in like young adults and maybe adolescents
Hmm.
that just got published a couple months ago or something like that. But what also impacted that? They were looking at states that were legal, but did the pandemic also play a
Right.
huge role in that? So I think that data might be like a little interesting
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
think about. But yeah, as this stuff becomes maybe more normalized, like how does society change? Do we start to integrate it into society a little bit more? Could it be another disaster? And I think that's what everybody's fear is, right? Like the 60s is going to happen. This is going to be too accessible. People are going to have bad trips and kind of flip out all the time. And
Right.
um,
The thing that kind of concerns me most, and so the biggies are like, are you going to destabilize some people with schizophrenia potential? Are you gonna have a bad trip? Anyone can have a bad trip and potentially get in an accident. Relatively rare, but it definitely happens in recreational use of psychedelics, like it would happen with any intoxicating substance. But I think there's like a range of potential harms that are just more subtle and difficult to. I think about kind of the so-called cultogenic effect.
mm,
The like when it's approved, for straight up medical use. The doctor that's running sessions at his house on the Saturday night with the young attractive people, and there's all kinds of bad stuff, boundary violations, and sexual stuff, and just like this cult vibe to one
yeah,
degree or another, even at more subtle levels, like psychologists and physicians kind of setting themselves up as, even if they're not labeling themselves as such, but setting themselves up as sort of religious leaders,
mm,
speaking with authority to the metaphysical realms that people often report interfacing with in one
yeah,
space. People often come out of these sessions, obviously, interfacing with what I call the big questions. What's the nature of reality? Does God exist? What's the purpose and the meaning in life? And I'm a strong proponent that you can kind of bring people to this mystery that is often there, but what they do with that, that's totally them. And I think there's too much in the field of, I don't know, researchers kind of trying to be like I don't know, the new age retreat leader.
right, right,
Like they've always wanted to do that, but they're just a scientist, or and like now's the opportunity, and like to fill in those blanks for people. I just could imagine all kinds of squirrely things happening
mm,
with and then I would just want like correct labeling. And so for example, if you go to a shaman of this or that tradition, or someone from a particular indigenous culture, or from this religion, I mean, maybe it's someone who's I don't know, a Catholic oriented. I think of like Brian Murarescu,
yeah,
who's he talks about potentially, oh, can we get the Catholic Church to actually formally get into this stuff? And you think about one day, like maybe there's a Catholic oriented psychologist who is conducting these sessions. Well, if it's on the label, if it's on your sign, like Christian therapist, like, okay, like buyer beware. It's like, don't be surprised if there's Jesus talk. But if you're a, otherwise secular, therapist, psychologist, physician, you need to stay away from those things without pushing them. But if you're, any type of religious tradition, indigenous cultures, like, yeah, do your thing, and that's fine. People know what they're getting into. Don't be surprised if you go to the shaman and they I'd say, well, the reason you're having this experience is because someone's put some sorcerers put a spell on you. It's like, I don't know that that's not true,
Yeah.
but like I wouldn't tell someone that as I have no evidence for that. I don't, it's not my framework. I don't have an ability to, even evaluate that. So, kind of like be aware of what kind of lane you're in terms of speaking to these domains.
It's really important. We've definitely have received feedback from folks over the years of like, I went to this retreat center and they had all these practices that I didn't know about. Right. And that really comes in that informed consent. So, like, as a consumer, you know what you're getting into.
Hmm.
I think there is that danger of just kind of finding places that aren't kind of providing any of that informed consent of like what they're actually doing.
Yeah.
And then they might be doing something totally different than what they're advertising as.
Hmm.
And then, how does that possibly cause harm to somebody? And so I think we do need to be really careful about that. And like, what's your lane? What type of thing are you offering? What is the training that you're doing?
Yeah.
It's really
And just be
important.
transparent about it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's what it comes down to, just honesty and, treating adults like adults
Yeah.
and putting the decision, here's the relevant risks and here's what you're getting yourself in for, and you decide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All consenting adults, and you can kind of experiment how you want to.
Yeah.
It's really important. I think we're probably going to need to wrap up here in a bit. This may not be a short topic, but I wanted to ask, you're talking a little bit about advancing psychedelic therapy protocols. And for me, I know I've kind of bumped up against that coming from, that inner directed approach, eye shades. And in ketamine therapy, I actually had a few people that didn't want to wear eye shades. I really had to sit with that and go, do I force this protocol onto them? And then coming from like a somatic trauma informed approach, I'm like, actually, that might actually feel safe for this person.
Right.
So how do I even just like, think that maybe this isn't the way to go? And so I'm wondering, like, have you spent time to think about like, if you were to advance like a therapy protocol, what would that look like?
Yeah. Yeah. I was actually speaking about this to some degree in this workshop I was giving yesterday about the need for flexibility,
Mm,
and how in some of the early research I was involved with, there was more of a tendency for folks to not want any deviation in the playlist. Like, even if the person was like, really begging for the music to be turned off because it was bugging them out. Like, well, no, that's the protocol. Like, that's the
yeah.
methods, like, don't screw it up. And so I'm certainly, there's an art form and a balance to all this. If someone's really just, if they don't like the music, you can adjust it. So I would sort of, I would generally suggest that, like, there might be a wisdom. I mean, I think I'd ultimately like to see studies compare, like, okay, does it work? These things work better when you have eye shades on versus eye shades
Mm,
off. Where we're at now, a lot of these conclusions are just drawn from clinical observation. So it does seem pretty convincing that you have different types of experiences with more of an introspective framework. And I kind of buy the old masters in Houston variety of psychedelic experience framework, where these are the Jungian psychologists in the late 60s that published a framework describing different layers of the psychedelic
mm,
experience, and how the perceptual is just that the top superficial layer, but then you have the personal psychological layer, and then a symbolic layer, and then an integral mystical layer at the bottom, at the deepest level. And that if you just focused on the pretty colors, like, you
right.
might miss the opportunity for these others, these potentially more helpful and kind of deeper layers to the experience. That makes sense to me. I'd be happy to, see the experiment, like, kind of testing that out. So I think, there is justification to, to use that as a default,
Mm,
like the eye shades, and encourage it. But yeah, don't get, if someone wants to take their eye shades off during the session, you don't tell them, like, no, you have to.
yeah.
You have flexibility. And I was talking about this a bit in the workshop as well. There's the idea that of inducing, allowing different forms of flexibility kind of built in. Like, I did a little piece of an experiment where I let the person pick their own playlist beforehand,
Mm,
not when they're in the session, but beforehand, pick an hour's worth of the musical playlist, music that was meaningful to them. And so maybe more like that. And for example, you could run a study where, half the participants pick all the music themselves, and then you have the other ones, they're exposed to some type of standard playlist, and, compare the results. But I think there's probably a lot of value in, it's hard to imagine this not happening in the future. Like, why not use the music that the person says, no, I can tell you the music that raises the goosebumps on my neck, that
Right.
is really meaningful to me, that takes me to another place. It's like, yeah, why not use that? Why not incorporate, I don't know, all kinds of other potential forms of idiosyncratic meaningfulness into
Yeah.
the session, to allow that variability. And the nice thing that's probably going to happen once we get out of this phase, at least with like psilocybin and MDMA, where it's only in clinical approved research now, if they're approved by the FDA for straight up treatment, all these, FDA is not going to control what music you use
Right.
or like how you integrate and all these other things. And so there's going to be this wave of naturalistic experimentation, which is going to be really cool. And
Think so.
then hopefully, people are safe, but hopefully there's an integration of a communication of like, the art of the practice of medicine and psychology is like, just through that communication, like what tends to work, what tends not to work, people sharing ideas. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I was just chatting with a colleague and friend that wrote an article for us a while ago about music, and catching up and hearing how he's trying to advance like how he works with music. And it's really interesting as people are starting to get more practice in this, like starting to develop these protocols a little bit differently and see what works, see what doesn't work. And that's exciting. It's like,
Yeah.
again, it's like we're in this infancy phase and it feels like we're just at the beginning. And I think the experimentation it's exciting. It's like, oh, where could this go? Like, we're kind of basing a lot of stuff off of what happened in the 50s and 60s, but like, how do we evolve that and move it forward?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think we're at time. Anything that you want to close with for today? Maybe any exciting news or anything that's exciting you here at the Psychedelic Science Conference? Or
Well, it's just exciting to see the growth. I was at the first Psychedelic Science. I think was it 2010, and it was just like such a small. I thought that was huge at the time. So
Yeah.
it's just really exciting to see the growth of the area. It's changing. It's coming with more good and bad. Like anything is going to as it expands.
Yeah.
But yeah, the meaning is really exciting. Like just the number of kind of random people that might like over the last day that say, "Oh, are you Matt Johnson?" And they say, "Oh, thank you for your work." I really,
Yeah.
or people, God, man, like people have told me, "Oh, I wanted to go into grad school because you." Holy cow! Like it's really humbling.
Yeah.
And like there's a lot of people that are doing so much good work in this area that is moving things forward, and yeah, a lot of good is happening. And so I appreciate that, sort of these connections that you don't even know as a field grows like this, that people are benefiting from it. So I appreciate the community. I appreciate humans are humans, things get complex, but within that complexity, there's a whole lot of people with good faith that really have great intentions and want to help people.
And I think a lot of people that are coming here have those really great intentions, right? Like, this is a really interesting field because it just feels like everybody is here to kind of help. And I felt that very early on. And I think that's like kind of what hooked me into this. I think my first MAPS conference was 2013. And, it's really kind of grown since, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like people want to come together and help and, foster this. And I also think, it's exciting with, as you said, the good and the bad, and the way the field's been developing, but also like some of the new energy, because I think those that have been around for a while, it's like, sometimes you feel a little jaded, but having some new energy to get some excitement getting
Yes.
back into it, it's like, oh, okay, yes, this is why I'm doing it. And continuing with the work. So I think it is good. Yeah.
You need that new blood
Yeah.
to keep things alive.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, Dr. Matthew Johnson, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, and we'll catch you next time.
All right. Looking forward.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Matthew Johnson. always so fun to sit down in person to do these interviews. I always feel like there's a little bit of a different energy that happens. And I left this interview just yeah, having more questions, right? Like being more curious as we were exploring in this episode. Like, we don't know, right? People are asking, why are we doing, this medicine for this condition? Why, this type of therapy for this? And, there's still a lot of growth and evolution that needs to happen, which I think is exciting. And, how can psychedelic therapy protocols evolve over the next few years, decades? Are we looking at the most optimal type of protocols? And, I've definitely had some thoughts about this over the years, just kind of weaving in a little bit more kind of somatic stuff and just thinking about kind of different interventions and different dosing protocols and stuff like that, like thinking about more of a titrated approach at times. So lots of kind of things to be thinking about, maybe some nuance based on individuals' needs and what they're trying to get out of treatment. So, and then just this whole idea around, integration science, like where is it, what is it? And, how do we measure it? What is integration at times? I mean, this is something we've been exploring for the past 7+ years here at Psychedelics today. And I feel like it's constantly changing, and I'm always continuing to ask that question. What is it? How do we measure it? And et cetera. And yeah, I mean, my thoughts have definitely changed over the years. So I think that's it, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, if you have any questions, comments, feel free to send us a email, info@psychedelicstoday.com. And another reminder, if you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, feel free to do so wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you follow us on any of the social media platforms. So with that, I'll leave it, and I'm wishing you a beautiful day whenever you're listening to this, and we will catch you on the next episode.